Welcome to another episode of the Reedman Report, where we talk about data, AI, education, risk, and security. And all of those issues come together in the intersection of a paper that we're going to discuss today. So my two guests are Dr. Eric Baldwin and PhD student Takuma Iwasaki from Stanford University. They're in the Donahue Lab, the Applied Economics Lab there in the Stanford Law School. They've got a new paper out, which is School Shootings, Their Strategic Contributions of Gun Policy PACs in the U.S. House Elections. And as you might imagine, they're on the show today because one of the data sources for that is the K-12 school shooting database. So Eric and Takuma, thank you so much for joining the show today.
Thank you for
having us.
So first of all, you've got a really cool sounding place that you're working. It's this within the Stanford Law School, this Donahue Lab where you're doing applied economics. What is applied economics? We're going to start with that.
The Donahue Lab, it is part of the Stanford Law School, but we don't really do too much legal research. It's like you said, applied microeconomics, which is really kind of what the economists call public policy or empirical social science. So it's all kinds of questions that fall under the broad umbrella of American public policy or even foreign public policy, but also political science empirical political science questions, crime, law, and economics. Anything that kind of falls broadly under any of those categories is work that we're interested in. And as of late, the thing that we're most focused on is campaign finance, of course, guns, anything having to do with guns and gun violence. And then, of course, our lab's leader and director, John Donahue, whose longtime specialty has been crime and abortion. And so anything that touches on those topics, of course, are things that we also pursue.
So before we get into the specifics of this paper, public policy is kind of a broad topic. Economics is a broad topic. What is the kind of question that would be answered through kind of some applied macroeconomics?
Yeah. So, for example, rather than focusing on like high level theory or econometric or statistical advances in the abstract, which there is a place in particular venues for that type of work within the social sciences and within economics, in applied microeconomics, we're kind of generally interested in asking questions that have real world policy implications. And so, for example, you might wonder kind of how corporations manage their reputation. How do they signal to the public that they care about certain issues? You're right. So there's a lot of discussion right now in the public sphere about ESG scores and kind of what are the ramifications of those? How does it change corporate behavior? That could be one thing in applied microeconomics, but also questions of how people behave, like why do they vote? Now, political scientists might answer those kinds of questions in more theoretical ways or in qualitative ways. But the applied microeconomists will model it mathematically and want to engage in what we call identification or causal inference, right? So trying to not just show correlations or descriptive patterns, but really tie things together statistically and in a causal way about why people and institutions do the things that they do. And in our case, we mostly focus on modern American life. Yeah.
Got it. So it's matching the policy and the impacts to something that's quantifiable and provable, which I guess segues kind of into where this paper is, where you're looking at the contributions by gun policy PACs to U.S. House elections. Where did that idea come from, and what made you think that those were going to be some rich data sources to start asking questions about?
Yeah, so we had long thought, and John had also wondered for such a long time, John Donahue, and kind of why is it that there is this persistent gun violence crisis in the United States, right? Not just in terms of school shootings, which obviously you know more than anybody about, but just general gun violence is really at an epidemic level in the United States, and yet there's really no meaningful reform. If we take a look at other public crises, such as like the recent pandemic, right, in which lots of people were ill and sick and dying, the government has engaged in a major intervention, launched a major set of programs to kind of help alleviate or address the situation. And yet, the gun policy situation, or excuse me, the gun violence situation is much worse and much more persistent over time. And yet, there is no major federal intervention. So, why is that? And I had also personally long been thinking about this issue really since I was in high school, in fact, because uh, I had actually heard on NPR once that kind of the NRA would put up billboards in towns after school shootings or after other types of mass shootings. And I just assumed that someone had already empirically studied it until maybe a year or two ago when I realized that no one had. And I thought, well, this would really help us if we can answer this empirically. It would help us better understand why there is this total absence of gun policy legislation, gun policy reform at the federal level in the United States.
So in this paper, you looked at the cases of school shootings or shootings on school property, which is within the K through 12 school shooting database. That includes both fatal incidents, non-fatal incidents, non-injury incidents. And with that, you were able to marry it to campaign contributions because you've got that data. How then from that process did you start to address your research question?
Yes. So one of the things, and in your data in the K through 12 school shooting database, like you mentioned, it has both the fatal and the non-fatal. And so we restricted it first to the years of our study for which we had the matching campaign data. But one of the things that we started at, actually before we even got access to your data, is we started to look at just general mass shootings, right? And so there's a number of data sets on that, the Gun Violence Archive, Mother Jones, the Gun Violence Prevention Project.
The Violence Project.
Oh, yes, the Violence Project. And we took a look at those, and actually we found that there was basically like no connection between campaign contributions and general mass shootings. And then when we got a hold of the data that you put together, we discovered that in that case, the non-fatal, so just general school shootings didn't really elicit a major reaction, right? And so Takuma had the idea, because I thought at that point, well, we can write a paper kind of on the null, and that this phenomenon that I thought might be present is not actually there, and which is an interesting finding in its own right. And Takuma had the great idea of, well, maybe we should just take a look at the fatal school shootings, and we should see like if there's one death, two deaths, et cetera, and kind of start to look at it that way. And that's where we really started to see very meaningful and robust effects.
So, like when reviewing prior articles, I found that most of the results focus on the mass shootings. But my question is, why they didn't focus on heterogeneity of shootings? Because shooting has a variety of aspects, like the venue, the race of like victims, for example. So that's why my first interest was the heterogeneity or the different characteristics of shootings. That's why fatal school shooting is like natural follow-up of like prior articles, and that's why we focus on fatal school shooting. And your database was so beneficial to our research interest.
For the audience who is not in a graduate or a PhD program, what exactly does heterogeneity mean?
Yeah, so I mean, like in this context, I mean, shooting is like a big picture umbrella concept, but depending on characteristic, they might have different impact. So, for example, mass shooting did not have any discernible or statistically significant impact. But fatal school shooting, as the research shows, has a significant impact. So it's kind of heterogeneity means so granularity of like impact, and our academic interest lies in how to identify which aspect of shootings has an impact on the for example, PAC contributions.
Yeah. So basically just slicing and dicing it in different ways by looking at non-fatal, fatal, mass shootings, school shootings. That's kind of, it's heterogeneous in that it's these kind of different things, these different angles of taking a look at the research question as opposed to kind of in a homogeneous way or kind of looking at just one, looking at the problem from one angle.
Yeah, I think about an area where the US has made incredible advancements in death reduction, and that's automobiles. And if you kind of took this and we took the guns out of it, if you looked at all sorts of motor vehicle accidents and did the installation of a guardrail or lowering a speed limit change the accident rate, you might not see anything. But if you broke them up into fatal accidents, accidents with serious injury, accidents with minor injury, and accidents with no injury, you might see that actually, that speed limit didn't change your low severity accidents, but maybe it had a profound impact on fatal accidents. So it's really, what is your direction? What's your question? And what are those impacts? Because if you're putting an intervention into place, or you're finding some effect based on something that's very severe, you might not see that same effect in something that's less severe.
Yeah, precisely. And in fact, the automobile example is a great one because we see that as the age of the automobile proliferated, especially in the post-war period, right, deaths went way up and the government intervened. And like you were just listing, many different types of interventions to reduce automobile accidents, injuries, deaths, improve the safety of the vehicles, improve the safety of the drivers, et cetera. They kind of tackled it from every angle at both the federal and the state level. And of course, today, while there's still a lot of automobile accidents and deaths, it's much better than it was in like 1965, right? And yet, with this issue of gun policy, it's a great counterexample of where there's been this just total void, a total absence of that kind of legislative policy intervention. Yeah.
Well, part of that is we haven't had the granular data like we have with accidental deaths, with drug-related deaths, with prescriptions, with in motor vehicle accidents. You can know all of these different variables involved in why that injury or death happened. That's part of why I created the K-12 school shooting database and added so many different variables. Because if you just say shooting or you just say school shooting, you don't get any of that nuance to it. Where, does a school police officer decrease shootings? Well, if you look at accidental shootings, no, actually a school police officer increases accidental shootings because they're a person carrying a gun, and a person carrying a gun has a much higher rate of accidentally shooting than a person without a gun. Now, if you look at, does a police officer prevent, fights from escalating into shootings? That's a totally different question that has different outcomes. And I think that's why, it's important to have these rich data sources across these different topics, because it opens up, lots of these different research questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the things that we found with your data is that we had previously looked in other places for school shooting data, and it was always so compartmentalized or incomplete or not really all there, whereas yours kind of pulls from many different places, right? And you get it in one CSV kind of comprehensively, so that we didn't have to do that work ourselves, because we had previously thought that's what we were going to have to do what you actually did, and then we found your data set. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you didn't have to recreate it, because making one huge database was probably enough for my life, and I hope that I saved a lot of other people that very tedious time. So then I think one of the cool things that happens in this academic research and your empirical research is you try to marry two different data sets together to create a finding. So what happened once you started putting together the school shooting data with the political action committee donations to these U.S. House elections?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So a little bit about the PAC data, the Political Action Committee. So that includes both the direct contributions, which are by federal law are limited to no more than $5,000 from a PAC to a candidate's campaign. And so that can either be an incumbent who's already in office or somebody challenging an incumbent. But then it also includes this other kind of world of money in politics known as the super PACs, or sometimes referred to as the dark money, which is much harder to get access to. Thus the title of dark money. And that is the indirect contributions, which are unlimited in nature. And the sources of that money, the PACs have to identify themselves, but where the PACs themselves, the super PACs, get their money is protected by law and can remain anonymous per the 2010 Supreme Court decision. So we don't really know where the PACs are getting these colossal sums of money. They're getting it somewhere. And we have some ideas that journalists pursue, but that's not really our realm. But anyway, so they deploy these amounts of money that can be unlimited, but they must be uncoordinated with the candidate or incumbent themselves. And the FEC, the Federal Election Commission, polices that very closely. And so we put all of that together because it's actually two different sets of data. And we obtained that data from an organization called Open Secrets, previously known as the Center for Responsive Politics. And we merged that with the K through 12 school shooting database and a balanced panel that in the end accounted for all 435 congressional districts, which is what exists at any one given moment in time. But it actually has nearly 480 congressional districts because we had to account for the ghost districts that either come into existence or stop existing as the result of redistricting. But they may have received money in those districts at a certain place in time because a school shooting may have happened. And so our balanced panel data set has roughly 168,000 rows because that includes contributions to districts where there was no shooting of any type, as well as those where there are shootings and fatal school shootings. And so then we can kind of track with that balanced panel data where the money is going and under what circumstances. And then, of course, we append that panel data with a number of demographic covariates from the Census Bureau, as well as election margin returns from Dave Leap, who puts together really great election data sets. And so we kind of merge it into this mega data panel. It's quite sizable. And that's kind of how we marry it and begin the more rigorous statistical analysis from that point.
And then what everybody wants to know is once you have all of that data and you start applying some statistical tools, what did you find?
Yeah, so what we initially find is that in general, when there are fatal school shootings in competitive House districts, so those are ones in which the last election in that district is within a 5% margin, that they increase the pro-gun groups increase their contributions by roughly 31%, and that the gun safety groups, so the gun control, the anti-gun people, those groups increase their contributions by roughly 20%. But what's even more notable is that as an election approaches, a House election every 2 years in November, if a school shooting happens, a fatal school shooting in one of these competitive districts within 2 months, the pro-gun groups increase their contributions by nearly 3,000%. To be more specific, 2,820%. And on the gun safety side, they increase their contributions by 917%. So this shows really a very, very clear pattern that they are acutely sensitive to the timing of these school shootings as it relates to an election. And they know that as a candidate approaches, election day in November, that they're particularly vulnerable if there's a school shooting, because school shootings naturally, as you might expect, trigger a lot of public outrage and grief and sadness as one would expect. And that might change how people vote. And so that is when the pro-gun aligned candidate needs to really be shored up. And in the more recent years, on the gun control side, their candidates need to be shored up so that they can actually speak out in support of gun control or gun reforms, gun safety reforms, without the fear of backlash from the other side, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so essentially when it's close to an election in a contested district, you have a fatal school shooting, there's a flood of donations to both of those congressional candidates, and the pro-gun lobby invests 3 times as much into their candidate.
Yes. Now there is one
that right there is a pretty profound finding, because we know that there's a lot of money on both sides of these issues, but that's an incredible disparity that in that short window of those 2 months after an acute event, that there is that much additional money that flows into one side.
Yeah, it's really the percentages are quite staggering in their size. Now, one thing about the gun safety side that I'll mention is that our study goes from 2000 to 2024. October of 2024 is the end of this study. And what we found was that for the gun safety side, that number that I gave you of 917% accounts for all of those years. But if you actually restricted and just analyze the gun safety side from 2018 through to the end, through to October of 2024, that number jumps up dramatically. And so the gun safety side, in just those years, their contributions within 2 months of an election in a competitive district with a fatal school shooting goes up to about 4,000%, which means that the gun safety side is actually, in some cases, spending more than the pro-gun lobby. But that's only in the most recent years, and that in fact, prior to 2018, they were much more stagnant. Would you say that's right? Yeah. They were more stagnant, and that the pro-gun side kind of dominated the landscape. Now, this is not part of our study, what I'm about to say, but our hypothesis is, and we've spoken to some people in the gun safety world that work at some of these PACs, and the general consensus is that the Parkland shooting in Florida in 2018 was this major catalyst that not only triggered their mobilization, but triggered people to give them, kind of regular people to give small dollar donations, which really added up. And so then they had, for the first time, really the financial ability to counter the gun lobby, and in some cases outspend the gun lobby. But that's in only the most recent years.
You mentioned the big landmark Supreme Court decision with campaign financing. This is Citizens United ruling. Did you look at any sort of changes before and after Citizens United to see if there was a level playing field that became imbalanced, or if it was the same all along?
Yeah, thank you. That is a good question. So also we focus on that point first. So we know that the potential impact of Citizens United. So that's why we first started with 2010 for an analysis scope, but we couldn't find any difference before and after the Citizens United. It might be consistent with another prior article that Citizens United has kind of limited impact as expected. So we don't know exactly why, but one of our findings is that we couldn't find any difference before and after Citizens United.
Interesting. There was a paper, and I apologize, I can't remember the author, but it was on the issue attention cycle and the number of congressional hearings on gun safety after Columbine and after some other school shootings. And it found that Columbine was the most sustained level of attention that caused the most kind of congressional discussion of gun related issues, but it didn't lead to any sustained policy. And then other seminal events have also triggered that same issue attention cycle, but it hasn't had any sustained policy impacts. And it sounds like one of your findings here is that a lot more money is flooding this issue, but it's not necessarily leading to any sort of clear advantage for either side of the issue.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Kind of one of the tragedies of this, beyond the obvious tragedy of so much death and so much gun violence in America, is that when both sides, as we've been talking about, are pouring in and investing such vast sums, these huge percentage increases near elections into these competitive House districts, in the end, the money kind of cancels each other out, right? Like it kind of just hits each other, and it has basically no effect on the outcome of the election. which means that, or it raises kind of the bigger philosophical question of like, well, if all this money is sloshing through the campaign finance system and specifically related to guns, like what's the point? We could probably use that money in better ways on some other social program or in some other way to improve society other than just kind of funding each other's candidates and then having no effect on the election at all. Now, some people would push back on that interpretation and say that, in fact, for the gun safety side, they view it a bit as a success only because for so much of the post-war period, and at least since the 80s and the rise of kind of the modern gun lobby, the pro-gun lobby has basically had the run of the show, the run of the place, and they've been able to do whatever they wanted, and they had vast resources to accomplish that. And that by simply stopping them from being able to do whatever they want in these competitive districts, or even in the non-competitive districts, by kind of bringing it to a null result, meaning like no effect from the money, that in a way is a success story. So that it's not just that the gun lobby is getting what it wants, it's that they now have to kind of play on a level playing field, and that voters' preferences might actually make it through to influence what these candidates' policy platforms are, if that makes sense.
So if I'm a person right now and I'm thinking about, say we've got the midterms coming up and this is a major election season, and there's invariably going to be some fatal shootings that occur in contested congressional districts in that period leading up to the midterm election. Is it worthwhile for me to put money into those campaigns on either side? Am I, as a voter, potentially impacting policy to either direction by deciding that I want to donate to one of those competitive candidates from either side? Or is it just an arms race where I don't really know if I'm going to have any impact or not?
Yeah, it's unclear. And as an academic, I don't think, I want to venture too much into like recommending what people do with their political money. But yeah, probably in the most competitive districts with a fatal school shooting, it probably is going to not have much impact. A regular person donating kind of a smaller amount, that's not going to have much impact. Where that money might actually have a bigger impact is in the non-competitive districts. Well, another finding of the paper is that in the uncompetitive or non-competitive districts, if there's a fatal school shooting and only one side invests money, because the other side considers it a safe district, a small amount of money can make a huge difference in reducing the vote share of the incumbent and maybe even flipping the seat. So I would actually say that if you want to look for the kind of places that are not the most contested elections, and that's where a small amount of money can make the biggest difference.
Yeah, and I think that's this is completely anecdotal, but it's in the news this week. So just 2 days ago, the father of the Appalachia High School shooter was convicted of manslaughter for the 4 students that his son killed at the school there in rural Georgia. And rural Georgia is very conservative and very pro-gun, yet there was a unanimous jury that convicted in just a couple hours this father of multiple counts of manslaughter. Really unheard of for it to happen that quickly, or kind of in these circumstances in that area. Is that kind of this same effect where you might have some people in the aftermath of a fatal shooting kind of questioning, is there something we can be doing better? Maybe some money flows into one side or the other, and then that could sway a non-competitive election.
Exactly. And I think that we don't study exactly that, right? Like after a jury decision and stuff like that. But if I had to guess, make an informed guess, I would say that if, for example, the gun safety groups went into that particular congressional district in Georgia and started to invest not even a ton of money, like fairly small amounts for campaign finance contexts, they could probably shift the vote share dramatically. making it a competitive seat as opposed to a safe seat for, I'm assuming, for the Republican Party. Maybe even flipping that seat, whether it be in this election or in the next one, but certainly putting the other side on edge. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating and counterintuitive, because you think of contested areas as being kind of the hotbed for policy change, but maybe it's places where the status quo is just such a given that somebody can upend it. What are some of the questions you feel like you couldn't answer from this data that you really hoped you'd have a clear answer for?
Well, one of the things that we recognized early on, but we've also been criticized for, is that we don't actually connect the money and the campaign contributions to actual policy, right? So we're kind of making an inferential leap there, or asking our readers to make a leap, in that we're basically suggesting that this money that is given in these campaigns is influencing candidates in some way or another, and that this is why that when they are elected and they're holding office, they don't pass, or they don't support certain laws, or they don't include those as part of their policy platform, is that money talks in American politics, and that money influences the way office holders behave and how they vote in the chambers. We don't actually prove that part. We prove the money. We prove all the other elements very, very robustly and very rigorously. I'd like to think, at least, and hopefully others agree that we do it robustly. But that final piece of connecting the money to the laws, to gun laws specifically, we don't connect that. And that's really kind of the researchers' black box, if you will. And so that's one of the questions we were unable to answer. Yeah.
Another unsolved question is, why school shooting so unique in terms of the impact on PAC contribution? So our study showed that fatal school shooting has an impact on PAC contribution, while mass shootings do not, or while non-fatal school shooting do not have any impact on PAC contribution. And another question is, why fatal school shooting is so unique? So we try to quantify kind of the impact of media or social media of fatal school shooting, but we couldn't fully solve why that happens. So that's one of the ongoing questions for us.
I think one of the biggest differences between school shootings and mass shootings is that school shootings committed by kids under 18 are hyper local. That kid is usually, from that community. The school is the center of their community, and the kid doesn't have a lot of mobility. Adults have much more complicated lives where they're moving between different places. They might have a job that is a far distance. It could span a different congressional district from, say, where they live. And in some cases, adults pick mass shootings that are far away from their home. I'm thinking about the shooting at the NFL offices this past year last year that was committed by a guy who lived in Las Vegas. So there's not a one clear congressional district where somebody has kind of purview and responsibility over that for a mass shooting. Whereas a school shooting, there's a very, very clear geographic connection for everybody involved, kind of at all levels of pre-incident, the shooting itself, and then dealing with the aftermath of it.
Yeah, that is a great point. Also, that's exactly what we are thinking about. And also, that point is really consistent with one of our findings. So our research showed that the impact of fatal school shooting is so local. So we couldn't find any impact in terms of the impact on statewide election, for example, a U.S. senator or state governor elections. So that is consistent with your explanation. So fatal school shooting has unique in terms of the localness, and the local community has policy salience in terms of gun control. So that's why fatal school shooting is different from other categories of shootings.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think there's some other peer-reviewed research that would support those same findings. There was a study by zip code single-family home prices after a school shooting, and that found that the fatal school shooting decreased the
Yeah.
single family home value within that zip code, but it didn't do something to it more broadly statewide. Another study was after a multi-victim shooting, emergency room visits, and emergency room
Yeah.
visits within the zip codes around that school increased for the next year for anxiety and stress related
Mm.
situations, but they didn't. It was not an overall effect where everybody in that state or everybody across the country was feeling stress and anxiety. So there's a lot of hyper local things, and like the property values for single family homes, that makes so much sense, because if there's a high profile shooting, somebody's not going to voluntarily move into a house in that school district if they don't think the school's safe or they don't want their kid to be associated with the name of that school. So when you get to make these highly discretionary individual decisions, that hyperlocal circumstance seems to have a pretty strong effect on that.
Yeah, that's a great point. So through our research, we found that this gun research is so interdisciplinary. So for example, as you said, economists talk about the impact on like land prices or housing prices, and education scholars are interested in what is the impact on like school performance after like Sandy Hook or like other devastating tragedies. And also our research is kind of close to policy research, and mental health is also hot topic about this point. So it's totally interdisciplinary, and that's why we try to focus on like this multidisciplinary aspects.
Kind of building on that, one of the things that I think is interesting to think about is that in this particular case, it's like Takuma was saying, and you were just talking about, there's no geographic spillover, there's no spillover on other offices, it's hyper local. But trying to get inside the mind, and right, we don't have evidence of this, of the pro-gun groups, for example. Like, why do they care? And it's very obvious in the data. It's just a very obvious in the event studies and whatnot that they clearly care about the fatal school shootings more than anything else. They don't seem to care about other types of shooting events, other types of tragedies. Even when we looked at like mass shootings with huge casualty counts, like the Las Vegas, the country music concert, where I think it was like 60 deaths, or it was really awful. They didn't have any particular attention in terms of their financial activity in that area. Now, that could also be because it's just not a competitive district, but they, even in the competitive places, they care specifically about when these events are happening in the context of schools. And trying to figure that out has been kind of a puzzle, and we're not really sure on the answer to that. It may be that they know that in kind of society's collective psyche, children hold a very kind of special and unique role, that they're kids are in schools. It's a place of learning, a place of vulnerability, that children as a society, right, we all agree, like children are needing of protection and kind of safety, and kind of being safeguarded away from the dangers of society. And so maybe they're aware that when children are in the environment in which children are present, when there are shootings and death, that this will trigger a kind of much deeper emotional salience for the public, for the local community, and that this is what they're concerned will change people's votes. Whereas if adults are killed in a shooting at a mall, for example, or at a restaurant or what have you, they're not as concerned that that's going to change how people vote. But when kids are involved, they're clearly very concerned that that is going to trigger people emotionally and therefore trigger a vote change.
Yeah, my theory has been that at K through 12 schools, and it would be interesting to compare this with universities to see if there's any sort of similar impact if it's a university shooting. But K through 12 schools are very unique places because children are in the custody of the state. Your parents drop a kid off, and for the next 8 hours, that school is in charge of their well-being. If they get hurt, it's the school's responsibility. The school's allowed to take them to the hospital. The school's allowed to give them medication. The school's allowed to have them talk to a counselor. So a parent is surrendering custody to the state until they pick the kid back up. And the contract is that the kid is going to be in the same or better condition when they get picked up. And if that contract is broken, an elected representative is a person who is responsible for that custody of the state. Something goes wrong at a shopping mall, what can your congressional representative really do? You could talk about police funding, you could talk about some issue with the mall ownership, but who knows? I mean, none of that, there's not this salient connection. But if you have a congressional district, schools, education is our biggest spending item in almost every jurisdiction across the country. We're putting enormous resources into it, that the promise is that your kid is going to be there for you to pick them up. And if that promise is broken, I think it's elected representatives who are the ones that the public points that responsibility at.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So from this, my last question for you is, what other research questions do you now have? Do you think that they're possible to answer? And what would you need to get started on your next paper and your next effort?
Well, I can tell you about our paper that will be coming out in, hopefully, fingers crossed, in the next week or two, at least as a public working paper. And I'll tell you a little bit about a project that's maybe a month or two out. But before I get to that, I just wanted to follow up on one thing that you said, because you were mentioning the difference between K through 12 and colleges and universities. And we've tried to look into the college and university shootings as a unique category, but there is no good data on that. Even when you subset in the other mass shooting data sets, the GVA and the Mother Jones, et cetera. So
at the Violence Project, we did create a university homicide database. And so that's something that I put together, kind of the framework for, and then a number of student workers at Hamline University filled it in. But that's every homicide on a university campus. And that was from a combination of Clery Act reporting and then also kind of open source news and media searches to either fill in the pieces and validate the locations. And that has similar variables to the K through 12 school shooting database. Unfortunately, it's only homicides because that's the only reported category that shows up consistently in the Clery Act data.
And so when you say homicides, can that be like multi-person incident, multi-casualties, multi-fatality homicides, like a mass shooting, or is it just going to be single instances?
Yeah, it has all. So it's shootings, stabbings, strangulations, whatever else.
See.
The majority
so it's not
of
just guns.
Yeah, the majority of them are shootings, but then you can filter that data to find, say, if you wanted to compare the single victim shootings to the mass fatality shootings, you could use that data set for that. If you wanted to compare stabbings to shootings to see if there was a change, that would be an interesting point there. But yes, that data set does exist. But unfortunately, the scope of the school shooting database, it took so long to put it together that making a similar all shootings database for colleges was just too difficult.
Yeah, well, that's exactly why I brought it up, because I thought if anyone knows of a good data set or even a lead to one that we could work with, it will be you, because we had in the past really struggled to find anything that was unique to colleges and universities. So thank you for that. We'll probably follow up about that. But getting to your original question before I went on that digression about our future research. So like I said, we have a paper that's hopefully coming out in a week or two as an NBER, National Bureau of Economic Research working paper. And that's looking at the state level, right? So in the paper that we've mostly been talking about today, we're looking at the federal level. So in this new one is at the state level, but specifically at the relationship between the state level interest groups, PACs, if you will, but at the state level, they're not always PACs. There's also other types of pro-gun and anti-gun advocacy groups, their contributions to state level office holders and governors. And basically the question is, do elected office holders listen to their constituents in regards to gun policy, or do they listen to the special interest groups? And does the money of those special interest groups talk more than constituents' preferences? And basically the bottom line is that in many cases, in many states, the gun interest groups get more sway than constituents' preferences in how elected office holders behave and in the laws that pass. What we find is that basically when there's a Democratic trifecta, in those states in which both chambers of the legislature as well as the governorship are all held by the Democratic Party, there will be increases in gun reform in terms of regulating gun, just basic common sense gun regulations, which is consistent with the polling data, that's what people want. Is even when they poll gun owners and people who are in support of the Second Amendment, even they generally support common sense, basic gun regulation, like enhanced background checks, red flag laws, et cetera. And so in Democratic trifecta states, they get those policies, whereas in the states with Republican trifectas, they actually counter public opinion and reduce gun regulation in those places. But the general trend has been towards deregulation, which is counter to public opinion polling that has been done over many decades that consistently show that the public supports these common sense gun reform measures. So that's one paper. And then just briefly, another one that's maybe 2 months out from being public is we're looking at the behavior of corporate PACs when it comes to gun policy.
Well, it sounds like when those papers hit, we need to have a follow-up discussion, because I think we just scratched the surface of how you find data, how you analyze data, what the findings really mean and where the holes in those findings are, and ultimately what are the policy implications, and then what are the additional questions you have, because there are no magic bullets in this gun violence problem. And anybody who throws out a simple solution probably has not looked at it from all of these different angles. So I want to thank you for that research. If people want to find out more about the Donahue Lab, what kinds of resources and what kinds of other research is taking place there?
Yeah, so there's research on criminal activity, on the relationship between criminal enforcement and ICE enforcement, right? That's a very timely topic right now, that'll be coming out in a few months. And if people are interested in seeing the research output that has happened in the past, they can go to the NBER, National Bureau of Economic Research page, and just look up John Donahue, because his name is on every paper. And that's basically a repository of all of the papers produced by the lab over the last 30 years during his time, both here at Stanford and at Yale, and with all of his collaborators and members of his team on the many questions of crime, abortion, guns, defensive gun use, et cetera. And so if people are interested, they could pursue that, and then and following our Stanford Law School web pages as well.
Awesome. Well, Eric and Takuma, thank you so much for your time today. Thanks for your contributions to the academic research and to this topic that sorely needs empirical evidence to support arguments. And I will look forward to talking to both of you about those subsequent papers when they come out.
Great. Thank you so much for having us.